Oh, after, yeah, after. Yeah.
Hey, George, it's Brandon. I'm on my way in.
I mean, do you think we require everyone? Obviously, we need attendance for this. Should we just do a roll call?
Yes, that'd be great.
Okay. All right, so let me go ahead and start because this obviously time is ticking and we already are behind. Good afternoon. My name is George Redmond. I am the chair of the Juvenile Crime Prevention Council. We're here on February 1st, 2024. This is a special session, particularly dedicated to racial and ethnic disparities within this county, and the data that we're trying to look at and ascertain is going to be given to us by Crystal and Lewis. Let me just go ahead and see who all is present, so we can just mark this on our agenda who we have here. If I don't say your name, just please pipe in. Right now I have Crystal Ann Lewis, I have Lindsay Holland, Angel Redmond, Brandon Priester, Don Johnston, Banta Whitner, Beth Kraft, Dr. Adrian Carter. I have Kadia Ross, Martin Moore, Sergio Fernandez. I believe it's Ty from Pivot Point. Vanessa. I got DK. Virginia, we just said that you were here. And Eric Robinson. Is anyone else that's on Zoom that I didn't say your name?
We have a few more guests. I see Kim Robinson with Asheville City Schools, Joe Jamison with United Way, and Ricky LeBrun with CDG. I'm not sure.
Hey, Hannah, that's the Carter Group as well, the RLR.
Great.
Or no, Ricky, that's right there. So if you wanna, you promoted some people, but not.
Besides those that are on Zoom, people we have present here, Hannah, myself, we have Judge Dotson Smith, Craig Loveland is out there getting some food, Sylvia Clement, Angela Garner, Jeremy Bricker, your name? Riley Ober. And down here, is it just one in there? I feel like a computer or something over
there. Vaughn with clinical program.
Okay.
I believe also getting food.
Okay.
Good afternoon, I'm Terry Bell. I work with the Business Services Department as well as Equity and Human Rights.
It's Bellamy. I was like, wait a minute. Thank you for being here.
It's my pleasure.
Good.
Juan Holiday, welcome alternatives, learn.
Gotcha. So I feel like we got a lock on the roll call. Again, if somehow you haven't heard your name at this point, what we'll do is continue to see who comes in and out on Zoom, or if anyone steps in person. At this point, I think we can go ahead and kind of get to the introduction of the presenter. Lorraine, if you're ready, I'll hand it off to you.
That's good. Thank you, George. Thanks. Thank you, Mr. Redmond. I'd like to present our speaker today, Ms. Crystal Wynn Lewis. Ms. Lewis is our Racial and Ethnic Disparities Coordinator for North Carolina Department of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention. Ms. Wynn Lewis has nearly 30 years of experience working with juvenile justice. She began her career in corrections a number of years ago, and shown a lot of leadership in her time with juvenile justice. She's mostly worked as directors of facilities management, including at AC Dillon and another center that we have here in North Carolina, as well as in juvenile justice in Virginia prior to that. In her current role as racial and ethnic disparities coordinator, she's here to share some data with us about racial and ethnic disparities and how to look at that and interpret that type of data, and to look at some of our key pieces here in Buncombe County. We just have data for this past year and it's fairly new. And so Ms. Lewis is going to take us through that to help us make better decisions and look at it and think about different access points within the community and in juvenile justice, how we can continue to improve access for all of our youth. So thank you so much for coming, Crystal, and for sharing with us today.
I'm not sure. Can you hear me?
Yes, yes. And we can see your slides as well. So it looks like we are at green light. Thank you all behind the scenes for being able to get this problem resolved. This time, Crystal, feel free to take it away.
Okay. All right, thank you. And I do apologize for the technical difficulties, and we got to figure out what's going on with it. But I think it's our connection. So good morning, everyone. My name is Crystal Lynn Lewis. I am the Racial and Ethnic Disparities Coordinator for Juvenile Justice. Unfortunately, because we wasted a little bit of time trying to get set up, I'm going to move a little faster than intended, but I do want to go over why we do racial and ethnic disparities in juvenile justice. Next slide, please. So racial and ethnic disparities as defined by the Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention Act, JJDPA, is minority youth populations are involved at decision points in the juvenile justice system at disproportionately higher rates than non-minority youth at the same decision point. This is the exact language from 34 USC 11103. Next slide, please. The JJDPA, which is the first comprehensive juvenile legislation passed by Congress in 1974. It's a voluntary participation, but North Carolina is a participant in the JJDPA, and there's 4 core protections. As a member of, as a state that complies with JJDPA, we have to meet certain conditions. And those certain conditions, there's like 33 of them, but the 4 core that are mandatory, or your Title II funding is lost or decreased, are the deinstitutionalization of status offenders, sight and sound separation, adult jail and lockup removal, and racial and ethnic disparities. The first one, status offenders should not be locked up in any detention center or jail. Those are those runaways, truancy, not going to school, those type of offenses. The second and third, sight and sound separation, adult jail and lockup removal. Simply put, there should be no child housed or in sight and sound distance of an adult inmate that's incarcerated. Racial and ethnic disparities is the last one. It was made a core in 1988. It used to be called Disproportionate Minority Contact, or DMC. And in 2018, with the reauthorization, it changed to racial and ethnic disparities. Next slide. And that's going to be the focus. Next slide. So we're going to talk about compliance of the red core requirement. Next slide.
Crystal, I'm sorry, we lost your sound when we switched to the state compliance slide.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, state compliance. For state compliance for Title II funding, we have to identify and reduce racial and ethnic disparities. When we got the reauthorization In 2018, they added the language that we actually had to reduce. In the past with DMC, we only had to identify points of contact and report the data. Now we're required to actually reduce it by a certain percentage. We have to develop a red plan and do an evaluation every 5 years of our racial and ethnic disparities across the state. We're also required to collect data on the contact points, which is what we're going to be covering for the remainder of the slides. The Governor's Crime Commission has a designated group, the JJPC, the Juvenile Justice Planning Committee. They are the state agency that monitors for compliance. Failure to comply with most of the components, but the mandatories, does result in us not receiving Title II grant funding, which a lot of our communities across the state depend on for programs for kids. So that is why we do racial and ethnic disparities. In addition to it being the right thing to do, we also are a participant in the JJDPA. Next slide. So now we're going to look at the compliance data. We're going to start out with the state data, and then we'll go into Buncombe County specifically for fiscal year 22-23. We collect data that we have to report annually on a fiscal basis. That's July 1st through June 30th of every year. Next slide. So prior to 2018, we used to have to collect data on 9 decision points. We still collect that data, but what we report to the federal government is just the 5 contact points, which are arrest, complaint data, those cases that are diverted, not approved, kids we place in detention, and YDC placements, and kids that are transferred to adult court. Under the last administration, they discontinued using the relative rate index, better known as the RRI. Our last administration wanted whole numbers and percentages being reported. We still collect the RRI, but that's just one measure to tell part of the story. So we still provide that, but we also encourage people to dig deeper when they get the RRI, because sometimes it takes on a meaning of its own, which really may not be the case. Next slide. Are we looking at the population slide? I'm sorry.
Yes.
So the population data is from 2020 census. That's the last published census report for the United States for kids 6 through 17. North Carolina has a little over 1.5 million youth ages 6 through 17. The breakdown are as follows. White youth represent 54% of that population. Black youth, 24% of that population. Hispanic, 17%. Asian, 4%. Native American, 1%. Next slide. This past fiscal year, we had over 37,000 complaints filed. That includes status complaints, status infractions. We'll talk about delinquent in just a second, but the total complaints that were filed in court services across the state were 37,017. However, when we talk about the kids that were involved in those complaints, that was only 15,355 kids involved. Next slide. Of the delinquent complaints received, we received 35,369 across the state. And those are delinquent complaints that involve 15,355 kids. Now, the breakdown of those complaints, almost 60% were in Black youth, 25% white youth, 10% Hispanic, other races combined, 5%. When we talk about disparities, this is what disparities looks like. When you have a population that's 24% and almost 60% of the complaints that come through. When we talk about the relative rate index, for youth of color compared to white youth, they're 3 times more likely to receive a complaint. We also zone in on the Black RRI, since that is the highest disproportionate group in the juvenile justice system. And the Black RRI statewide is 5.16, which means that Black youth are 5 times more likely to receive a complaint than their white counterpart. Now, briefly, when we talk about the RRI, proportionality is a value of 1. Anything above 1 is disproportionality, except in 2 areas. That's not approved complaints and cases disposed. But anything above 1 is disproportionality. The RRI also is only one way to look at causal factors. What has to happen is a formal assessment should be done along with the quantitative research, because it only tells you to what extent, but you have to do surveys, interviews, and additional research. One of the reasons why they stopped utilizing the RRI is because people were taking that RRI and stopping there and not digging deeper. So the last administration went strictly to percentages and whole numbers. Next slide, please. When we look at the cases that were not diverted statewide, almost 40% of the cases were either not approved or diverted. Of the complaints that white youth received, almost 50% of their complaints, 49%, were not approved or diverted. For Black youth, who had almost 60% of the total complaints, had 35% of their total not approved. Hispanics, 37% of their complaints not approved. Next slide, please. When we look at detention placement for last fiscal year, we had 2,839 kids placed in detention. As you can see, 70% of those kids were Black kids, 17% white, 9% Hispanic, 3% multi-race, and 1% of the other races collectively. We had a 4% decrease in the amount of white youth that were placed in detention. However, we had a 20% increase in the number of Black kids that were placed in detention. Next slide. YDC confinement. YDC confinement had 173 kids placed in YDCs across the state. Of those complaints, 17% of those placements, 17% were white youth, 71% were Black youth, 5% Hispanic, 7% 2 or more races. It's important to point out that confinement totals were 173. And when we talk about disparities, obviously the Black youth had the largest disproportionate placement in the YDCs. We have made some progress. Next slide, please. Over the past, since 2000, for the past, probably the last 4 years, we had almost 1,000 kids in detention almost 20 years ago. And to date, we're down to 177, which is significantly lower. So we know we're not bringing kids in to keep them locked up long term. In addition to that, over the past 4 years, if you can look at the scale, you can see the disparities are significant. We've made a lot of progress across the board because the majority of the disparities continue to be amongst Black youth. But the little wins are wins regardless. For the past 3 years, we have been reducing it. Even with race to age, we have been making movement in the right direction as it relates to disparities. And our efforts and our community partners, along with our law enforcement friends and school friends working together, we hope we can continue that trajectory. Next slide, please. One kids statewide this past fiscal year. That's an increase of 11%. White youth had 11% of the transfers. That was a 23% decrease from the previous year. Black youth represented 74% of those kids transferred, which is an increase of 21% from the previous years. Hispanic, Latino population, 9%, other races, 6%. Next slide, please. Let's look at the classification. When we talk about violent offenses, that's class A through E felonies. Serious offenses are class F through A1 misdemeanor, and minor offenses are class 1, 2, and 3 misdemeanors. Of those 37,000 complaints, as you can see, even with raised the age children, we still continue to be statewide in the single digit for violent offenses. Violence offenses only constitute 7% of those complaints that we receive. 32% were serious offenses, but the majority of the offenses that came in by way of complaints were minor. 57% were class 1, 2, and 3 misdemeanors. So we know that the majority of the offenses are offenses, if we were adults, that could probably be handled in communities. Status offenses actually went down 17%. That was 5% of the complaints we received, and that is a 17% decrease from the previous year. Next slide, please. But when we look at the offense categories, violent offenses amongst all the races, you see that Blacks have 67% of the violent offenses that came in this past fiscal year. White youth had 17%, Hispanics had 11%, and the other races combined 5%. We look at the serious offenses. 64% of serious offenses were from Black youth, 21% white youth, 11% Hispanic, and 4% other races. And then when we look at the minor offenses, the class 1, 2, and 3 misdemeanors, 56% of those were on Black youth, 29% white, 10% Hispanic, other races combined. Next slide, please. But when you look at each one of these offenses, violent, serious, and minor, by each race specifically, either rate pretty similar. Youth, the majority of white youth complaints were minor, 5% were violent. When we look at two more races, the majority were 59% were minor, the class 1 and 2 misdemeanors. Same with Hispanic, same with Black, same with American and Native American. So the point on this slide here is the rate. There's no race that's more violent in terms of complaints and petitions that come through, because they're about averaging the same in each category. The majority continue to be minor offenses. However, when we talk about the disparity, we always see that when we bring them all together, the majority in terms of volume are the Black youth or youth of color. Next slide, please. Let's look at North Carolina school-based complaints. Next slide. 35% of the complaints that came through this past fiscal year were from the schools. 13,011 complaints. Of that total, 33% were white youth. Black youth represented 50% of those complaints. Hispanics, 11%, and the other races combined 6%. Next slide. When we look at across the state, the top 10 school-based offenses, here's your listing. Simple assault, disorderly conduct, simple affray, communicating threats, possession of weapons other than a firearm and explosive on school grounds, truancy less than 16, communicating threat of mass violence or on educational property, simple possession of a Schedule 6 controlled substance, assault on a government official, employee, assault on a school employee, volunteer. These are your top 10 charges from the school system of North Carolina. Next slide, please. So now let's look at Buncombe County. Next slide. Next slide. So Buncombe County's youth population for youth ages 6 through 17, you have 32,367 kids according to the 2020 census. Of that, 75% of those youth are white youth, 9% are Black, 13.5% are Hispanic, Latino, Asians represent 2%, and less than 0.5% Native American. Next slide, please. Buncombe County had 620 complaints, delinquent complaints, that is. Of those complaints, 48% of those complaints were on white youth, 195% were on Black youth, 14% on Hispanic Latino, and the remaining races or two or more was about 7%. In Buncombe County, youth of color are 3 times more likely to receive a delinquent complaint. Black youth in Buncombe County are 5 times more likely. And as you can see, with a Black population of 6 through 17-year-olds of 9% in the community and 32% of the complaints, it begs to differ for you to ask additional questions as to what are those infractions for these youth. Next slide. When we compare the population with the complaints, as you can see just in these two illustrations, you see the population is 75% for white youth and 40% for the complaints. The population for Black youth, 9%, yet the complaints received were 32% Black. Hispanics were about proportional, 40% of the population and 15% of the complaints. Next slide, please. If you look at the complaints from the previous year, you had 500, I'm sorry, go back, please. I do want to show you that there was a 2% increase in the number of complaints that were received. You had 547 last year, and this year you have the 620. And these are the 2 full years of Raise the Age youth. Next slide, please. And hit the button one more time. If you would click, okay, there we go. So when we look at the complaints not approved or diverted, Buncombe County had about 38% of their total complaints not approved or diverted, which is great. Of that total, the complaints received on white youth, 43% of their complaints were not approved or diverted. Black youth had 36% of their complaints either diverted or not approved. Hispanics, 31%. Other races combined, 28% of their complaints were not approved or diverted. Next slide, please. You had 53 kids placed in detention. Of that total, 42% were white youth. That was 22 kids. Black youth represented 21 kids, 40% of that total. Hispanic, 11%. Other races combined, 7. This is a slight increase from previous years. You had 47 kids that were placed in detention. But you can see here, 18 were white and 20 kids were Black. Slight increase on both ends. The relative rate index, either color, slightly over 1. Either color, 1.31 chances of being placed in detention than their white counterpart. Black youth almost 1.5 times more likely to be placed in detention. Next slide. Why do you see? So are we ready?
Yeah.
Right.
That's right.
Yeah.
So we're on transfers.
Is that a yes?
Yes. Were we on transfers? We might be.
You were on transfers.
Okay, next slide. You had 2 kids that transferred. Those were Hispanic.
It's really good.
So now we're looking at your classification, your violent, serious, and minor and status offenses. And as like the state, the majority of your offenses were minor. Only 4% of those complaints were violent. 23% were serious offenses, but 62% were minor and 11% were status offenses. Next slide. Just click. We're going to go through each one for our race. Just keep clicking, just once. Okay. Okay. When you read down for violent offenses, 18% white youth, 48% Black youth, 30% Hispanic, 4% other races. When it comes to serious offenses, 57% of the serious offenses were white youth, 25% Black youth, 12% 12% Hispanic, 6% other races. Minor offenses, 47% white youth, 32% Black youth, 15% Hispanic, 6% other races. And for your status of infractions, 45% white youth, 29% Black youth, 5% Hispanic, and other races, 21%. Next slide. Click again. And when you look at each of the races or the offense categories separately, similar to the state, the majority of the offenses for white, Black, Hispanic, and other continue to be minor offenses. White youth minor offenses were 60%, 61%, Black youth 65%, Hispanic youth 67, other races combined 50. Violent offenses 2%, white youth 6%, Black youth 8%, Hispanic 2%.
Crystal, can you?
So the rate of offending.
I believe so. Thumbs up.
Okay, let's go on to the school-based complaints.
They can hear us.
Okay, so 49% of your complaints came from the school system. 340.
Oh dear.
I think this is still ours. I think it's just the title. I think the title is weak, but is the data still ours?
It still looks like us though.
It is. It's yours.
Thank you.
I'm sorry about that. We did wait and
Be very excited, I think.
got emailed the. No, it's bunkum. It's bunkum. Next slide, please.
There we go.
So last year, okay.
Back one.
You want to go back?
That's it.
So your school-based complaints went down 15%. You had 401 that came from the school system. Last fiscal year, this fiscal year was 340. Okay.
But this is where we could use these numbers and say, look, yeah. So that's why when it says a 6. Oh. Mr. Redmond, do you remember, or Hannah, that is our SJP, the simple possession 6, part of that shouldn't be happening?
Yes, that is aligned with school justice partnership.
Mm-hmm. Did you say number 6 or?
Schedules.
No, the Schedule 6 one. We were just kind of looking at these 10 and recognizing which ones are part of school justice partnership. And so if we're seeing numbers there, that's something maybe we could address.
Right, 1 and 2 for sure. I'd love to see number 3 too.
1, 2, and occasional 3, right?
Yeah, and I think when we start talking about number 1, as broad as that communication is right there, that could bring in even the assault side of things when there is no disorderly conduct. I mean, I have found where our SROs are using disorderly conduct as a catch-all, and we've got to get better at that.
Okay, thank you.
Well, definitely if it's by engaging in fighting, because simple afraid is.
Right. Yes. Yeah.
And we have disorderly conduct number 9, so it looks like that they've just separated the two, where one's more engaging in assaulting behavior and one just could be yelling profanity or, just causing a disruption.
I gotcha.
As opposed to delaying that, where we could have her in person, we felt that this sort of information is readily prevalent to what we need to get going on regarding
I think
breaking
getting
down.
the PowerPoint to all of us will be tremendously helpful.
Yeah.
So that's the.
And it's possible that we could see if there's another time she could come back and unpack it more with us. So.
My apologies, I need to scoot.
Thank you, Judge.
Thank you everyone for your patience and for being here. It's so important. And thank you, Crystal. And I'm sorry it didn't work out so well, but we'll look forward to hearing more later.
Thank you, Judge. It does.
So I know we're waiting to see if Crystal can rejoin. Would you guys like to just walk through the next couple slides and then have some discussion and hopefully she can rejoin us?
Any discussion so far?
Angelica, do you want to just, let's see, we can come back to this slide if this is one that folks want to focus on, but I believe that there's let's do one more, is that right? Yeah. So I can help talk through it, or George, if you want to talk through it.
Well, I mean, obviously everyone can read the screen. I guess this is the next steps that we have, obviously using this data to understand the disparities within our community. We got to discuss this with JCPC as we look to plan, monitor, and allocate, analyze the resources that we are allocating out to try to address disparities as best we can. Obviously talk with law enforcement. We got Loveland here, talk with the Sheriff's Office, how we're going to change the direction regarding some of these SBOs, especially with what's aligned with the School Justice Partnership. And through that, obviously the community referrals and redirecting of the schools to start at least referring a lot of these situations through that route.
And seek community and family input on the matter and listen to what young people have to say. I know that there's a lot of similar discussions happening in the reparations process and in other collaborative spaces around town. So we'll continue to try to align efforts as much as possible.
It seems like it'd be important to perhaps on our agendas for us to carve out some time to kind of digest sections of this and attack it that sort of way, because it's a lot, but I don't want to wait until the end of school year and then we start, if we can kind of piecemeal it up until the summer where we're at least tackling certain things in our agenda, maybe 30 minutes or so. Let's look at this part of the slide and focus in on that. Maybe we can move along throughout the year and still address the data that we've gotten. I just don't want to get it and wait for a while. I'd like for it to remain fresh through our agendas if possible. But I'm open to any sort of recommendations as to that.
When's the next JCPC meeting?
February 15th. So bringing you back here in 2 weeks, this being a special session, you'll be right back here very soon. That one will be at the normal time of 8:30 in the morning to 10 a.m.
Is Crystal still on?
Crystal has not rejoined yet, as far as I can tell.
It would be interesting to see how she would like to navigate or would feel our best interest in how we would navigate it. Because I already feel school-based complaints. I already feel like a slide I already know I want to jump into, but maybe that's not the first one to start at. I don't know if she has any recommendations as to where, if we were going to kind of piecemeal it and go through it, where should we start? And maybe we can just get that information and we can just carve out something on our agenda. We'll get the slides at some point by the end of the week.
I believe so. I just need North Carolina Department of Public Safety, Division of Juvenile Justice is approving what goes out. And just for context, I know that some of the JCPC members have heard this before, but this is really the first time, last year and this year is the first time that DJJ is actually really, with Crystal's expertise, digging into this data in a way that can be shared publicly. And this is actually the first time that we have had access to this level of data for Buncombe County. And they are being very intentional with having Crystal walk local communities through the data before just sending it out. So we're really grateful for that. And yes, as soon as we have permission to share the slides, we will do that. And they will be publicly on shared on Engage Buncombe, along with the Zoom recording, which, you know, for folks who want to carry through, they can fast forward.
Please do. Please
Perfect.
do.
Angelica will edit it with fidelity to public meeting requirements, but yes.
And if we don't get it by a certain time frame.
Here, Crystal is on speaker. Crystal, I've got you on speaker on my cell, so you can at least, George has gone through, as the chair, George has gone through the questions and the guidance you put at the end of your PowerPoint for ways to use the data.
Yes.
So Crystal, go ahead.
Yes, sir. Go ahead.
So Crystal, as we went through this, our next steps is what we want to try to focus in on, but I wasn't sure if there's a pathway or guideline that you can direct us as to how we cipher through. I've already seen certain slides I want to jump into. with the JCPC, but I don't want to know if there's a recommended order as to how you would think we could do that.
The only thing I can tell you is what the experience has been across the state. There's no way to give you a guideline on how you guys are going to jump into the data. One thing that my job is to provide you with the data so you can have a baseline of what you look like right now. You have quite a bit of things going on, but you have some great stuff happening because of the way the processes are going through the court system. Most of your complaints are either adjudicated or not adjudicated, and the kids are placed on supervision. The effort is to keep the kids from coming into the juvenile justice system. The data, you can't underestimate the data. It can help you better understand the racial and ethnic disparities within each of the jurisdictions. But you need to use the data to help law enforcement and judges and communities to make informed decisions. You have the actual fact of what is going on this past year. And then when you talk about programs, look at the program. Is there a program in locations where kids of color can have access to? Are there some difficulties? This is where the programs that are existing now can have some conversations about what can we do to better grasp those kids that seem to be getting into trouble for very minor offenses, but actually having contact with the criminal justice system. So the data is to give you an idea of what's going on. The numbers are so minute that you guys can actually put your heads together and figure out a way that you can maybe branch out and find out if there's something specific with this group of kids that we're missing. Is there something that's needed with this group of kids? And that's working with Sylvia. And your consultant, Lorraine, to find out the type of kids. They do assessments, you do assessments. You know what's going on with those kids. Talk to the family, see what their troubles are, because lots of times if you talk to them, you can get some good information. But this is a baseline. Yes, sir.
So real quick, I had one question I wanted to just kind of find out. So when I was looking at the population of Buncombe County, it showed 75% of the population from age 6 to 17 was white, 9% was Black, 13.5% was Hispanic. Out of that, I then looked at the slide that talked about complaints, and it said 32% of the complaints were Black. So going from 9% to 32%, my initial question is, does this differentiate between an individual who has multiple complaints, right? So if a kid has, some kid, once they start off, they then could get 4 or 5 more. And that can add into the story. It's not really telling, or is it telling that different individuals are getting complaints? Does that kind of make sense? I feel like maybe somebody can get stacked with 5 or 6 and then it kind of throws the numbers off. Is that?
It does make sense.
Okay.
And you make a valid point. So here's a conversation with law enforcement. 9 times when I showed you the state data, I showed you 37,000 complaints, but 15,000 kids that were involved in those complaints. I report to you what we have to report to the bank, which is the actual number of complaints filed. But obviously, the kids are getting stacked complaints.
Yeah.
If the majority of the complaints are minor, yeah, you may not have 620 kids that had complaints. It could be half. Right now, we're talking about the complaints. That's a conversation. Hey, why are you kids getting stacked complaints? After you find out the future, the total number of kids that were involved, then you can have a conversation about, is there something you can do about that? 9 times out of 10 when kids get stacked complaints, a lot of times when they go to court and take care of a couple of programs and services, some of those it's reduced down to just 1. So you're right, but I'm only providing the data.
Okay.
The issue here is RRI is 5.32. That means those complaints, the kids of color, the Black kids were getting complaints at a much higher rate, 5 times more likely to get a complaint, whether it's that on one kid or not.
Right.
Crystal, this is Lorraine. I have a question for you about this. One, I was wondering, as far as I know, the PowerPoint you shared today was information to go over in the meeting. And I guess and then will it be the data from the PowerPoint that you would get approved to forward on to the Buncombe JCPC members to look at and work with in the future, or would it be just the Buncombe data? What do you recommend as far as that goes?
I'm going to give you the entire PowerPoint.
Okay.
I'm going to just send you the entire PowerPoint. Of course, with that correction for Wake County and put Buncombe County on there, and then the wrong one over, but you're going to get the entire PowerPoint. The purpose of the data is to utilize this data to have conversations with your partners. You want to work together. It's not about, pointing fingers. It's about what we can do to make the situation change. We're all in the business of helping children. And we all agree that we need to do the best we can with the services we're providing. There's no sense of wasting dollars on programs that may not be working, or programs that are not accessible to the kids who actually need it. And now you have the data. And you can use that information and make informed decisions when you're sitting down ready to write out on the program. That's what it's all for.
Thank you. Yeah, that sounds great. I think this JCPC, I have all confidence in them that they will move forward with lots of good discussions and plans moving forward to how to address the concerns.
I have a question about data availability. Is there an age or geography breakdown that would take some of this analysis a little bit further?
Crystal, did you hear that question? If there's an age or geographical location where that kind of information from this data can be drawn from as well, or is it just complaints that come through?
Well, you can put in a request for more specific information with our data section, and I can provide that on the PowerPoint that I emailed to you, Hannah, shortly, so you can get more specific data. In terms of the numbers, I'll put that down to match up with the number of complaints, so you can have an idea if there is a problem with kids getting that complaint. I'll add that slide in there so you can have that with your with the final product. But yeah, one of the things we don't do is try to isolate a school or a location because it's a county problem, and we want everyone to work together. We're stakeholders in this thing together as partners. So whatever the issue is, and the numbers being so small, just like the state numbers, we're doing something about it, and that's all that we ask.
Anyone else have any questions? You're a person.
I wasn't sure who asked the question before, but you can also go, just for looking at school-based data, I'll just remind you all, when we shared this earlier in the December meeting, we mentioned the School Justice Partnership dashboard, and that is a dashboard that you can go to look at school-based complaints specifically by county, and you can take some time with that to look at male, female, different races, things like that, and types of complaints. There's some information there you can go if you want to go drill down on your own and kind of look at that.
Right.
I think the other publicly available data source that doesn't get into the nature of the complaints, the levels or anything like that, but just overall referrals to law enforcement, is the Department of Public Instruction school report cards has total numbers of referrals to law enforcement and a couple of disciplinary measures broken down by race and ethnicity, but it doesn't get into the level of detail of what the School Justice Partnership dashboard you can look at. Is it minor? Is it a felony, misdemeanor, or felony? But you don't have any deeper breakdown as far as where the referral came from, other than schools across the county and city in general.
Well, Crystal, I know we're past our time. It's supposed to be what, 2 o'clock, and it's 2:05. So we greatly appreciate you and your patience and all the information that been able to give to us today. We look forward to being able to get the slides so that we can start dissecting what we need to do here in Buncombe County to help JCPC find the resources out there to correct the disparities that obviously the data has. And so thank you for presenting today. Thank you for having the patience to endure technology. And hopefully we can have you back at some time later this year as we get into more of the details so that you can be involved that way.
Absolutely. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Crystal.
I do apologize for not being there in person. That was my hope. And I will be the next time we sit down and look at the numbers. But you guys keep up the great work. You all are doing a wonderful job in Buncombe County. And you can't do anything but go up and get better. I'll have this information hopefully before the end of business today or tomorrow to Hannah so you guys can begin the work. Thank you so much.
Crystal, one final thing is, will this come out again every year? Is this an annual thing that we'll get stats on?
Yes.
Okay.
It is. We do it every year.
Okay. Thank you, Crystal.
Thank you.
You too.
Thank you so much.
Thanks to all of you for your patience and enduring.
You guys are rock stars, though, seriously.
Technology, yeah.
This is probably the most
I would have quit
kind of
first.
Yeah, I've never seen it that, like, it's usually pretty reliable.
I'm looking forward to the edit on this and to making it look
What was that?
polished.
You thought it'd been a day.